Hello and welcome to Traveler's Tips and Tales. My name is Ben.
I'm Jacob.
And I'm Michael.
Today we'll be talking about character creation. And just for those who might not know or might not have any idea, Michael, what do you think of when you think of a character?
When I think of a character, it really boils down to their mannerisms, their habits, their personality, the way that everything kind of shines through. Their looks play a little bit into the character. You got to determine how a character will look. But the personality is more of the defining features in my eyes.
And Jacob, what about you? I know you have a little bit of a different perspective or a different idea on what a character really means to you.
Yeah, I agree that personality is very important in character building, but I typically start off with the numbers first. I typically try and figure out the personality after I start playing the character so I can really get a sense of what they're like, but I always start off trying to figure out what my class should be and whether I should try and focus on one ability rather than others, and I try and make sure that all my features when I'm building my character all work together so that way I can be the best form of this character as I could possibly be.
Yeah, I definitely agree with both of you guys. Both of those points are very essential to what building a character is. I think that the most important step for me personally when building a character is to first talk to your dungeon master. You know, figure out what the setting is, figure out what he has in mind, what kind of world is this going to be, what kind of adventure is this going to be, what kind of person that would be great for this adventure. You know, is there a certain race or class you want to use that maybe the DM is not comfortable with you using because it just doesn't make sense? That's an important thing to think about and to know before you go into it. I'm sure that you guys have had times where you have gone in hoping to use something or hoping to do something and it just comes out not really feeling right or not really making sense. I know I have lots of times.
Yeah, I fully agree that almost every step in the character creation process and also just the character, continuing to build the character, the most important thing you should do is always talk to your DM. Make sure that they're cool with the choices that you're making. Some DMs just have certain problems with certain features in the game. You know, you never know if, something just doesn't work out for that DM, and it's always nice to make sure that that's all cleared from the table at the beginning of the process. So that way no one's hopes gets left out.
Definitely. The DM kind of sets the example of what's acceptable in their game and at their table, and being able to work with the DM in creating your character and creating your character's personality, what they're able to do. That's all stuff that's really important when discussing with your DM, because that's when you can really find out what's appropriate for the game setting and just make sure that you are playing something that works well in the game.
Yeah, and speaking of, all this discussion we're having of making characters, I think we should get started. So, when you are starting out, the first thing I like to do is to look at your race. Like in fantasy, that could be dwarves or elves or even humans, they're in that world. It could be something unique like Kenku in 5th edition, which is a type of, bird person, or it could be something unique and very, just unique to the world that you are about to be playing in. I think that it's good to start from that base and then you work into, what did this character do in life? What did they do before they were an adventurer, before I started playing them, maybe? What is their background? And once you've figured that out, figure out what do they do? What is their class? What are their features? What do they like to do? That is how I like to do it. What about you guys?
I know starting at race is probably one of the best ways for me. You can use a lot of the resources that are available. D&D Beyond has a bunch of the resources ready. You just have to purchase them on there. If you'd rather have the hard copy, you guys can go and get the books. There's a lot of sources that you can use. I know this is where talking to your DM is really important, because your DM might not allow you to use all the books. They might want you to stick strictly to the player's handbook, which is the base guide for all your character creation, which still has plenty of options. But race and class are typically tied at first for me. I'll switch off sometimes depending on how I'm feeling. If I want to play a certain race, I'll pick that race and then determine which class will work best. But typically, I try to look at class first just to see what race would make more sense and also provide the most benefit.
Yeah, I agree and disagree at the same time. I personally start with class typically first. I think it's the most important thing to figure out at the very beginning, because you can. I think it's best to communicate with the whole party when building your first character. Everyone should try and figure out what classes we want to use, so that way we can make sure that our team comp is pretty well. Everyone's covering the bases that they want to cover, and there's a tank for the team, someone who can take the hits for some of the more glass cannon kind of people, other things like that. I think it's very important to figure out the class first, and then I typically move to the race. I try and find whichever race is best suited for the class that I pick. I'm also known to play the same races over and over again because I really get obsessed with that certain race. Hashtag halfling. And then I typically move on to background afterwards. Background is kind of my last step. It's typically where I start to figure out what type of personality my character makes. I feel like I normally move on to background after I figure out most of my number crunching things, and I try and figure out who my character is at that point in the creation process.
Yeah, and speaking of crunching numbers, why don't we discuss a little bit how that works? I know that that's one of your favorite things to talk about, Jacob.
Well, yeah.
So let's start first of all with what we just discussed. So every race has different benefits, different bonuses that you could get to different stats. And the stats that a lot of people will be using in 5th edition are strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. And those can determine a lot of different skills and abilities that you would be using in the game. A lot of the races will have different bonuses to those things. Backgrounds can give you different skills that you might be able to use, and classes will be determined a lot by what skills they pull from. So, like, for example, a wizard uses intelligence, a barbarian has strength, a rogue has dexterity. So, let me ask you, Jacob, how do you prefer to go about determining, what stats you're going to use, how you're going to do them? Do you use point buy? Do you roll? Do you use standard array? I don't know of anyone that does.
Yeah, so typically, most DMs that I've played with typically use 46, and you drop the lowest numbers. So what you do is you roll 4 different d6, and then whatever the lowest number is, you just don't count it, and then you add up the other 3d6, and whatever that number is, that will be one of your stats.
Oh.
And then
before we go on, the d6 is a 6-sided die. For anyone who is not familiar with the terminology, we'll call it a d6 for a 6-sided die, or a d10 for a 10-sided die, or a d20 for a 20-sided die, or a d100 if you're crazy, or
like you.
Hey, I didn't deny it.
I'm jealous. I'm definitely jealous.
Just wanted to clear that up for anyone who might not know.
Yes.
Continue, please.
So you'll roll 3 or 4d6, and then you drop the lowest one, and then you do that 6 times to figure out each of your 6 ability scores, and then you can rearrange them into whatever order you want. This is typically the first thing I do in the process ever, like at all. Before I even figure out what class I want to work with, I try and figure out my numbers first, so that way I can make sure I have enough numbers for what I want to do. Good numbers or bad numbers, per se. I think bad numbers are just as important as good numbers, personally, because I think that flaws are a big part of D&D. But yeah, so that's the one I typically use. It's the most common that I feel like most of my DMs have, that is what we do. And then another option is 3d6. So you roll 3 of the d6, and then you will re-roll the 1s and the 2s. So you get a minimum of 9 and a maximum of 18. And I think that one's also pretty good. I don't typically use it, though, normally. but that's another option. And then there's another thing that's point buy. Ben, I know you're more well versed in point buy because
Yeah,
you do
so-
not like the chance of the die.
So
If you wanna
at
describe
times,
that
yes. So maybe you don't want to risk rolling 4d6 and getting all ones. You have a 3, and a 3 in D&D is terrible. A 10 is what an average person would get, and 20 is the highest you could ever get. And 1, you're dead. So 3, you're pretty bad at that thing, whatever it may be. Maybe if you have a 3 strength, you can't even stand up. You can't even walk. If you have 3 dexterity, maybe you can't even move your fingers or your arms. It's a very, very bad thing to have happen, and I've seen it happen. So sometimes maybe you want to play it safe. You want to use point buy. Point buy, everything starts at 8, and you get, at least standard point buy, you get 27 points to buy into any of your stats to raise them up. And after you hit 13, it costs 2 points to level it up to 15. And that's where it caps, is you can only get 15, so you can get higher if you roll, but it guarantees that you will never go lower than an 8 on any of your stats. And I think that for some people, for some players, that is a good thing, because it makes them feel like they can still have a choice and still have a chance to not mess this up, to not start the game at a severe disadvantage, or maybe start the game stronger than the DM is anticipating. I think that it's a good way to do it if you're not keen on rolling high numbers. Some people are cursed to do.
I did play a rogue for my first character, so I'm pretty good at rolling d6, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's also another way to do it, which is called standard array, which is a set of stats that you would use for whatever class it is that you're deciding to play as. You have to use the stats that are already preset. Not a lot of people do that, because it takes away a lot of the fun, a lot of the creativity, but it is an option. It is a thing that you can do.
And those preset stats will typically be 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8, arranged in whatever order you want them to be. I've used that a couple times when I just really wasn't feeling lucky and I didn't want to deal with point buy, but generally I'll roll.
Yeah. A lot of the DMs that I've played with personally also implement a rule where if you roll below a certain number, you have the choice to be able to not take it if you don't want it. Me personally, when I DM, I cap it at 7. If you roll lower than a 7, you can re-roll it if you'd like. But I do encourage, if you do want to keep the 5 or whatever you rolled, then be my guest. If you really want to be really underpowered in one way, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So once you
I think it's
finish
also you think it's okay if you want to talk to your DM and you say, hey, I want this stat to be lower than 8. I want this to be lower than it should be. Like Grog Stonejaw in Critical Role, he has a 5 intelligence.
I think it's 6.
6 intelligence. 6. Yeah, so he lowered it on purpose, and I think that that's also a really cool thing that you can do.
Yeah,
well.
I'm pretty sure he's literally illiterate. You can
So, but once you have your stats, we move on to the next thing, which is adding in your racial bonus, which we talked about a little bit earlier. But go ahead and tell us about a couple of your favorite races and what their bonus might be.
Typically myself, I typically start with class first, so I figure out what kind of race. I narrow down the races based on what racial bonuses they give. Some races give more in dexterity kind of thing. Some things are more physical races. Some races are more mental races. And by physical and mental, I mean the ability scores. They're literally split in half between physical and mental ability scores. So the first 3 are strength, dexterity, and constitution. Those are all physical. And then the intelligence, wisdom, and charisma are all mental. So some classes are more focused towards the mental ones, more like spellcasters, and some other classes are more focused on the physical ones. Those are more like the frontline fighters kind of things. And so typically I'll start with a class and I'll figure out which one of my 6 ability scores is the most important. And so I'll generally crank the biggest number into that one. And then I'll try and pick a class that adds 2 or 1 to that ability score. whichever one can make the number an even number, which is important because when you determine what your actual numbers are, what you do is you take the number that you have, say you have a 15, you subtract 10 from it, so now you have 5, and then you divide it by 2 rounded down, and you get a 2, and that will be your like modifier for that number, if that makes any sense. So you will use that number plus your proficiency bonus when figuring out your skills. But yeah, so typically I try and focus on whichever race gives the best number for that specific skill that I think is most important. But that's just how I do it. Ben, I know you play different, and Michael as well. So how do you guys focus on which racial bonuses you want?
I like to pick my race based on, the region where they might have grown up, or maybe the type of story that I want to portray. I usually don't think about the numbers too much when I'm building a character. Sometimes I do. Sometimes I'll pull a power game move and I'll say, hey, I want to make this character able to do this, 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 and this, and be the best in the world at this and this and this. But most of the time, whatever race they are, it just adds flavor for me. And whatever the stats are, then so be it. I'll roll with it, and it doesn't really bother me too much, whatever it might be.
Yeah, for me, I'm kind of a mix between Jacob and Ben. I'll try to build based off of a general backstory that I might want my character to have, what they went through growing up, and what kind of race would fit that situation best. At the same time, while looking at the race that might fit it best, I'm also looking to see what race will benefit my class in the terms of numbers, and how can I find the best combination of those two that makes the most logistical sense, where, say for a dwarf that I'm making, I made a dwarf barbarian, and he ran a forge in a different far-off world. But I picked him because it made sense, because dwarves are very hardy and strong, and as are barbarians. And it worked him being a blacksmith, because, blacksmiths, they need to be strong. They're out in the heat all day working weapons and armor, and that was the best combination of everything for me. And it also happened to be the classic stereotype for that classic barbarian trope,
Yeah, I think that the mix of the perfect balance between the best of both, the numbers and the story, I think is the best way you could possibly do it. I think that's like the goal of every D&D player out there. But
Yeah.
let's touch on something very important. One might say the very heart, the life of D&D, hit points.
My personal curse of this game.
With all your low rolls.
So
I roll good, except for hit points.
So
Never
there are
roll good for hit points.
two ways to look at hit points, in my opinion. One is, it is a number that shows how tough you are, how many hits you can take before you go down, how much damage you can take before your character cannot go on. Or it could also be looked at as how lucky you are, or how good you are at avoiding a fatal blow. So let's say you have 12 hit points and you keep taking, little hits. You're not dying, you're not getting hit to the point where you are in threat of your life, but you keep, dodging. Maybe you only take a nick or a scratch every now and then, but that one hit that takes you to 0, that really does you in, that's when your luck runs out. I think that those are the two best ways to look at what hit points are and what they mean in game.
I agree, but I typically look at it in both ways. It depends on my character. So recently, I just started playing a Warforged, which is a robot, and that character per se, I more so look at it as the luck side of things, where every hit that hits him beforehand is just a little dink in his outer shell, right? And then the one hit that finally gets me under 0, which is pretty tough to do for this specific character, but the one hit that finally gets me to 0, that's the one that really, it really gets inside to my internal processors and such. But Most of my other characters that are a bit more fleshy and less metallic, I typically think of it more as how long you can physically take the blows in the first description rather than the luck.
Yeah, hit points are kind of a fickle thing depending on what you are playing as. If you're playing as a barbarian or a fighter or any frontline character, you're looking at having a huge wealth of hit points, generally speaking. Whereas if you're playing more of a spellcaster type who sits in the back like a wizard or a sorcerer, you're generally going to have a lower amount of hit points because you're not going to be focused on in battle, or at least that's the idea. You guys pretty much covered pretty well what hit points are, but we didn't really go into how you get hit points yet, and that's what I wanted to touch on here. There's a couple of ways that you can work with your DM on getting hit points. The two ways that are most popular that we use in all of our games, you can either roll for hit points after your first level, because your first level you automatically start with whatever die size you have, whatever the max number on that die is, plus your constitution modifier. Beyond level 1, generally you will either roll for your health and add your con modifier, and then add that to your previous health, or you can take the average, which the average would be determined by the die size. A d6 would be a 4, a d8 would be a 5, and you can find more of the averages and stuff later on. We're not going to go into every single average.
Yeah, very important to touch on that each class, has a different hit dice, and they all have different amounts of hit points, with Wizard being the lowest and Barbarian being the highest.
Wizard and Sorcerer is also a D6, I believe.
Yeah, you're right. You are correct. In 5th edition.
Yeah.
But how would you increase your hit points? That's the real question here. And
There's
usually
a couple ways to do it.
Usually the answer is you level up. And you can level up a few different ways, but the most common way is through gaining experience points.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you love to count your experience points, Jacob.
Well, I just like to make sure it's a fleshed out number,
Every encounter, what's our XP? What's our experience?
Most of the time I'd wait till the end of the session, alright? Come on.
But you never forget.
Someone has to remember. Someone has to remember, right? If no one else is going to do it, I'm going to say the words.
The other way you can do that is by what they call milestone, which is once you've reached a certain point in the story, you'll level up. And you'll gain, all the abilities of whatever level you have just reached. Which is maybe not as common, but very useful in some circumstances, because maybe the DM wants to take it a bit slower. He wants a little slower pace, or maybe he wants to go very quickly, and he doesn't want to give out all the experience points and have to do all the math and worry about all that.
I personally prefer milestone. I think it's more interesting, and it can play more into the storytelling aspect. I think the DM has a lot more control, and I think that's a good thing. He can set the pace for how he wants the characters to feel throughout certain points in the story. If he wants to have like a low point where all the characters seem to be at their low, he can drain them of a level for a little bit and make them feel like they're not as accomplishing as much so easily. They're really fighting for their progress as characters. But he can also, if he wants to amp up morale kind of with the players, he can really just start throwing levels at them, and there's no way for the players to argue because they don't have XP. But XP is also pretty good if you're starting out DMing, you don't really know how you want to pace your story quite yet, and you can just leave it to the numbers. The characters, they figure it out whenever they go.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
It's also pretty good.
In my eyes, I think milestone is the most beneficial in terms of it deterring your players from going out on every side quest they can find and becoming murder hobos, which is just a term to reference them wanting to kill pretty much any creature that comes within their range of attack. And the way that it deters this is because you can have them go through as many encounters as you want, but if they're not progressing the story, then they're not going to level up under milestone, because you're generally going to level them up once they hit certain points in the story that you've created for them.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But I do see the place for experience points, though, because it definitely feels like that old school D&D dungeon crawl experience. You know, you go through, you kill a bunch of creatures, you kill a boss, you get experience, you level up, you go through the dungeon. You know, it's definitely has its place. But I do agree, Milestone definitely has a very good story aspect or story motivator that goes with that as well.
I fully agree, and I also think that Milestone is better at keeping the players all as equals. I know in my first game, the game that Ben played, we put Ben DM'd. I mean, Ben did experience points, and I personally showed up to every session. I'm proud, and and so my character obviously leveled up more than the other characters because they just simply weren't there for every session. And so it's way better for keeping the party as equals and making sure that everyone is equally powered, because eventually at some point my character just became real OP because one, I was kind of breaking the game, and two, I was just a higher level than everyone. And I think it better levels the player dynamics between your characters, your party. I think that's very important.
Yeah, and towards the end of that game that Jacob was just referring to, just an example of what he's talking about there, his character, I believe, was level 18 when mine hit 14. So you have a major power surge there compared to everybody else, but that's also kind of a reward for you being there every session and being prepared to play.
To be fair, though, I do think that your character for level 14 was really freaking OP.
Yeah, and matching items did have a little bit to play in that.
Yeah.
Can't argue with that.
Yeah, and but you know, in defense of experience, I have seen people online, you know, discussing it. And one of the great things about experience is you can actually reward your players for doing really cool things by giving them a little bit of extra experience points dribbled in. And I know I do that sometimes. I might not mention it, but I'll, you know, if the experience to every person is 15,712, I'll round it up. I'll say, oh yeah, you get 16.
There were definitely a couple of boss fights where we killed the boss in like a cool way or something, and you were like, you know, this was this number, but I'll go and round it up because that was really cool. And it does make you feel really cool as a player.
And another really big thing, if you're DMing and you're running an experience-based system instead of milestone, don't forget to throw your players the experience points for maybe avoiding an encounter that would have been deadly, because that is something that a lot of players don't understand, is when they're faced with a fight, if they are just absolutely desperate to get XP, they might try and win that fight no matter how impossible. But if you're giving them experience for also making the smart move thematically and avoiding the fight, then that might also help reinforce the idea of self-preservation in the game.
I also must say, earlier we talked about how I just showed up more than the other players. I cannot stress it enough that I think, me personally, I think that no game should go where not everyone in the party is at the game every time. I think every session should include every player, and if one person can't make it, I think the game should wait. Personally, that's my personal opinion. Some games are really hard to put on because a lot of people are in them and a lot of conflicting schedules, but I personally think that every game, every player should be at the table, so that way, even if you're doing XP, everyone's still pretty much level, you know, everyone gets the same amount of XP, it all works out better like that. That's my opinion.
Yeah, in a perfect world, you know, every D&D session, it would be a session every day, and every person would show up every day, and we would never do anything other than play D&D with that group all the time. But unfortunately, this is not that.
Yeah.
I mean, in a perfect world, we can at least get to the point where everybody can communicate properly on a time that works, but even that is impossible about 99% of the time.
Do you guys remember when, I'm not going to mention names, but when a certain friend of ours tried to organize a game, every time he messaged the group, no one would respond, and then I would ask the same question and everyone would respond?
I do
felt
remember
so
that.
bad. Here's
I
the
get-
thing, though. I felt so bad, but I never answered because I wasn't in the game. I'm pretty sure I wasn't in that game. So every time we just had one big group chat where it was all of our D&D buddies that we all play with, and not everyone in the group chat was in the game. So
And
that's my personal
mind you,
excuse.
listeners, this happened probably a solid year ago. I play video games with this guy, and he still talks about it every now and then.
yeah,
It was such
and
a
this
consistent
went on
problem.
for like months.
Yeah, it was such a consistent problem for months. Even his own players now have he has trouble getting a hold of them for some reason.
Yeah, I
But-
don't think that game has gone on in a while.
Well, since-
It is not.
Yeah, it's
Especially
he has
since
trouble.
quarantine.
Yeah, he has trouble getting a hold of his players now. But I have asked his players, because I was about to be in his game for 1 or 2 sessions. I said, "Hey guys, when should I be there?" And everyone responded, but they don't respond to him.
Respect your DMs, boys and girls.
Yes,
They try
please.
very hard. They work very hard for your game, for your enjoyment.
Please respect. But moving on,
Yeah.
let's discuss proficiencies. What are they? What are they good for? What kinds of proficiencies are there? I'd like to start with, what is a skill proficiency? A skill proficiency is something that you are proficient in. There's a list of skills in Dungeons and Dragons, and they are affected by your stats. And if you are proficient in them, you get to add your proficiency bonus, which is determined by what level you are. And it makes you better at doing that, and it gives you a higher bonus to add when you roll. There's also weapon proficiencies, what weapons you are good at using, there's armor proficiencies, what armor you're very good with. There are tool proficiencies, what kind of tools you can use. And are there any others that I'm missing? Vehicle proficiencies?
Yeah, there's vehicles.
Instrument.
I think.
Instrument
Most of them,
proficiencies?
yeah. And there's also, I think, game types. So
Yeah.
you can be
Yes.
proficient in like cards
Yes.
and dice.
So essentially a proficiency is
Oh,
something that you
languages.
are skilled at, something that you are proficient, especially good at, that you have been trained in, perhaps. Is that how you guys would put what a proficiency is?
Typically, yeah. Something that you know more about per se than other things.
Yeah, it's something that you have received at least a basic level of training to where you know more than the average person about that.
I personally look more so at it on the number side rather than just proficiencies, because some proficiencies will be bigger than others based on your ability scores. So I don't look at it as per se as I'm trained in this one skill better than this one, but I look at it as more as like I've trained in this type of skills more than this other type of skills per se. So like my more flexible like agility kind of things more than my intelligence kind of. That's what I do.
Yeah, and it's important to look at, what proficiencies do your race give you, because some races give you extra proficiencies. What proficiencies does your background give you? What proficiencies does your class give you? And the reason that's important is because when you're playing through the game and it's good to look down and see, oh, I'm proficient in that, I should try to use that skill more often. But it's also very important for when you're choosing your equipment. Before every adventure, before you even start the game, sometimes you just need to know what equipment is good for me. Can I wear this plate mail armor and still cast my spells? Probably not. But you might. Depends on what you're proficient in. Can I wield this giant battle axe? Or am I stuck with using a simple club because I'm not trained in it? And I think that is a very important question to have to ask before you go into looking at equipment. So there's a couple ways to get equipment. Michael, what do you prefer to do? Do you prefer to buy, or do you prefer to start with your equipment?
I'll generally start with the equipment that I get from the background. And the background is mostly where you'll get your equipment. You also get a couple things such as armor, weapons, any class-specific stuff from your class itself. And then you'll generally, depending on the background you have, you might get 5 gold, 10 gold, or there's even a background that I have in a character I made recently that gets 25 gold to start. And you can use that 25 gold or 5 gold or 10 gold, however much you have, to buy extra equipment before the game starts. And I'll often do that. Just sometimes the DM might want you to wait, and then you can go do it in-game. They might have a different plan for how much money you'll have. That's where it goes back to talking to your DM. But generally I'll start with the starting equipment in gold, and then also go buy some extra stuff.
I fully agree with that for the most part. I typically do the same thing, but if I have a specific type of character build that I'm going for, I will just scrap it all and just buy it all myself for a chance at more so buying things that I think this character would have and not having things that I think this character wouldn't have. I think it's very interesting. I know one character I had in particular, they were kind of a nerdy character, and so I vouched for them not having necessarily an adventurer's pack in their possession, so I started them out with just like their basic weapons and such for their class, and then like that was like it. They just had like extra books and other things like that, but they didn't have like the things that they typically try and buy for most of my characters, like rope and other useful things. I vouched for not having it for that character as kind of a setback for them.
Yeah, it definitely gives you more roleplay opportunity if you choose to buy your equipment rather than start with it. I know, for example, I have had a character where I desperately wanted them to start with a pickaxe and some climbing gear and some stuff to start a mine, because that was his whole thing. He wanted to go digging for gold, so he started with a gold pan. He started with things that you could go mine with and look for gold with, and that was a thing that he really desperately wanted, and he basically emptied out his entire backpack of all the things that a normal adventurer would have, like torches, like rope, rations. He didn't bother with, you know, carrying food or water with him, because he was so desperate on getting this that he just kept all that stuff on him instead.
Yeah.
And it's a very fun way to express, you know, what kind of person is this guy? What kind of things do they have on their person? What kind of things do they carry with them? What do they prioritize? That being said, once you have your equipment, you have your race, you have your class, you have your background, you have your numbers, your stats, your hit points, once you do manage to level up, what kind of things can people expect? For one, they'll get more hit points every level.
Thank goodness.
Yes, which we touched on a little earlier, so I don't think we need to go back into it.
I love how stingy I am with it, though. Like,
yeah, definitely.
I'm so bad at rolling, but I will roll.
You used to roll like 2s or 3s on every time.
Literally, my first character, 8 levels in a row, I rolled the 2 in a row. I also didn't have the greatest con, but, you know.
Yes, but let's talk about a thing that every player dreams about every time they level up: ability score improvements.
Oh yes.
I would argue that I don't look forward to them.
That's because you look to the alternative.
To feats.
Yes, which it's the same thing. That's the amazing thing about it.
Yes.
So an ability score improvement lets you choose to add 2 to one of your skills. Not skills, sorry. One of your stats. Or 1 to 2 of your stats. Which is an amazing thing, because you can get that boost, you can get that bonus. It improves all of your skills. It improves your, you know, what you need to be better at your class. It expresses you getting better.
It really helps out too if you were more lacking in the rolling for stats in the first, you know, in the session 0.
Yeah, it definitely helps make up for that. But at the same time, there's this amazing thing that you can do. Instead of taking an ability score improvement, you can take a feat.
Oh yes, I love that so much.
Now, being our Pathfinder designated specialist, Michael,
yes.
Do you want to explain what's so amazing about feats?
Yeah, sure. So feats allow you to get a better customization on your character. They provide various different things that your character can learn how to do. And the reason he brings in the Pathfinder is in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and even more in Pathfinder 1st Edition, actually,
Yeah.
feats drive the entire game. Your whole character is based on what feats you pick, and that'll really determine who your character is. But in 5e, feats aren't necessarily as big of a deal. They're more there to kind of support different aspects of your character. If you want to be able to improvise with weapons in your surroundings, you can take a feat for that. If you want to be able to stop somebody from attacking your teammates, you can take a feat for that. And these are all things that you can take at the same time as when you would take an ability score improvement.
Or if you are like me, there are very, very nice feats that just add HP. They just give you more hit points. I love them.
Oh yes, tough.
But yes, I think another big difference in Pathfinder 2 and 1, of course, and 5th edition is whereas you would normally get feats for your class, like on other levels that aren't on these levels where you get ASIs or ability score improvements, you get to choose a feat for even those. So even the basis of your class is totally different. You can have two of the exact same class, but these characters are so outstandishly different because they just took different feats throughout their entire character build, which I think is super interesting.
Yeah, in 5th edition, it's much more streamlined. But at the same time, it's much more easy to understand, easier to get into. I know even we are a little bit confused still at Pathfinder 2, and we've even played a couple games already, so
Definitely.
it's still
It's a lot
very
to take in.
confusing. It's a lot to take in. But a very important thing that I feel like I should mention now, when leveling up, if you improve a stat, specifically Constitution, which determines your hit points. If you improve that, and you get to the next level where instead of a +2, it's a +3 now,
Yeah.
it acts as if your hit points just gained all the hit points as if you had Constitution that high the entire time. So if you're level 10 and you just got your Constitution to +3, since you just gained a 1 onto that modifier, and you're level 10, you just gained 10 extra hit points. And I think a lot of people maybe don't know that or don't realize that at first, and that has killed a couple characters because they just didn't know that their hit points were that high or should have been that high. I just wanted to throw that out there. But yes, so your feats in 5th edition can definitely help you branch out, maybe not be so streamlined as a character. I know you have a character who can punch and then punch again and then punch again and again and again and again, as long as he never misses that punch.
Well, that's from a magical item, a home
But
magical item.
it's helped by
Yeah.
Sentinel, by your feat.
Yes, I did improve upon the item very much by taking a specific feat called Sentinel.
Yeah, so sometimes
It's
it's
just-
just that feat is just a little bit of the extra icing on the cake that really helps cement home, send home what it is that your character is trying to do.
Yeah, I fully
And I
agree.
think it's very important to consider, do I need this stat increase or do I need this feat? What's important to me right now?
And
And-
that is typically something that I look at from square one. Back when I'm putting in the numbers where I want the numbers to be, I think about, what class I'm going to get, how many ASIs I'm going to get, and what I want to do throughout it. It's pretty common for me to actually just make a little like timeline for my character, and I make a little schedule for when I hit this level, I'm going to take this feature instead of taking an ASI, even though I could still use the ASI, and then, at a later level, I'll increase the ability score.
Yeah, and there are some feats such as like Keen Mind or Squat Nimbleness that also will add 1 to one of your ability scores, and that will also kind of help out. So it's almost like you're getting a 2 for 1, but more of just 1.5, I guess.
Yes.
But those feats, they are very helpful. They can help out when you feel that your character might be lacking in some areas. You might be able to find a feat that'll kind of help make up for that.
I agree. Sometimes I'm looking to just add 1 to one of my ability scores. I don't need the second one, so I'll look around throughout the feats and try and find one where I can also get another benefit out of it, rather than just adding one to one ability score and then throwing an extra point into some other score that I don't need it in.
Yeah, it definitely is a very useful thing to go and look through and just say, hey, I only need this, and I would really appreciate, being able to remember anything perfectly for a month. That's an amazing benefit.
Yeah.
But another great thing that comes with leveling up, or sometimes at level 1, depending on your class, is your archetype.
Mm-hmm.
And the archetype of a class determines what kind of flavor your class is going to have. If you're a sorcerer, did you get your magic from draconic bloodline? Did you get it from maybe one of your ancestors was affected by a fae and you can't control it and it's wild magic and it goes everywhere? If you're a paladin, do you devote yourself to this kind of god or this type of order? Or if you're a barbarian, when you rage, do you get extra attacks? Do you throw lightning bolts at people from across the room? It can determine so much. And for those classes that choose it at level 1, I feel like maybe your DM should have sometimes be able to say, maybe you can hold off until you see what the rest of the party is like before you have to choose. Yep. But sometimes it's very good to have those at level 1.
I find myself personally, repeatedly, I have to test my characters, almost all of my characters, their builds per se. A lot of the time I'll build a character wrong, or I'll build them up and I'll start playing and I'll realize I don't like how this character this ability works for this character. I chose this one archetype maybe earlier when I didn't fully understand what I really wanted to do with this character maybe. So I find myself doing that a lot. So I personally try and play test all my characters. I play them in a one shot or some other thing, or I'll just like level them up and run myself through a combat situation all by myself sometimes. I think it's pretty important to play test your characters before you really throw them into a campaign.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Sometimes, especially with people who like to look at the numbers side of things, sometimes you'll build a character and you'll feel really confident, really good about it. And the thing that they're really good at in combat, maybe the DM just doesn't care, doesn't use that against, it just doesn't work against the enemies they're throwing at you, or
Stuff
maybe
just doesn't work out.
It just doesn't mix with the party composition that you have. And I think it definitely is a great thing to be able to say, hey, can I just rework this?
And I've done it a couple times before.
Yeah.
For sure.
And it's never a bad thing to talk to your DM and be like, hey, this isn't working out the way that I hoped it was. It's still early. Can I just change this out?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's another thing that ties into the whole talking to the DM, knowing the setting that you're playing in, and really working with the DM on all that stuff, because some of that can be avoided sometimes, some of it can't, because you might think that something sounds really cool, but you haven't taken Jake's advice there where you play test it and you get into your game and then you find out that it absolutely sucks, you don't like it, whatever it may be, and now you're regretting your decision, so you have to talk to the DM and try and get it changed.
Oh, trust me, I do it plenty myself. I'll play test it and everything, and then the stuff will just still not work out how I thought it would in combat a lot of the times. Yeah, it's a hassle sometimes, but yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely great to talk to your DM, look at, what... And also look at what kind of person your character is,
Yes.
Especially with the more roleplay heavy classes like Paladin. Paladin, oh my god, you have to really know what kind of person you are, because whatever you choose, that archetype, it comes with a set of rules. Yeah. And if you break those rules, the DM, well, depending on the DM, they might not care, but if they are a DM who really likes to put care and pay attention to that kind of thing, they could take away all of your paladin powers because you have just broken your oath that gave you those powers in the first place. Or if you're a druid and you start abusing nature in a way that then maybe nature doesn't appreciate, you might lose your powers. You might lose your powers and your magic.
My personal favorite, the warlock.
Yes, the
You don't
warlock.
you don't make your patron happy. Guess what?
Yes. Or like with what you did with my warlock in your game, where my patron that gave me my magic couldn't keep up with how strong I was getting.
Yes,
And I
you were
had to
leveling up
switch
faster than
patrons.
her.
Yes,
And-
so I had to suddenly I had a
Yeah.
new patron. I had to work under someone new that I had never
And
agreed to.
they had different objectives than your first patron.
Yes, and that it can definitely lead to many very cool role play opportunities if you really pick and really
Yeah.
play into whatever you have chosen.
Yeah.
Which leads me into my next thing. Speaking of warlocks and clerics and paladins,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these classes don't just have a sword or a shield or a dagger or a bow. A lot of these
Or fists.
have or fists. They have spells, and
Yes.
spells work different in every setting. In every game, spells are different.
Pretty
And
much.
in 5th edition, they're sorted by level. And the basic, most bottom level you can ever get is called a cantrip. And a cantrip doesn't cost anything. You can do it as much as you want. Certain classes will let you pick a certain number of cantrips from a certain list, and those are yours. Those are your skills, that part of you that you can do whenever you need to. They can be used over and over again. They can be some kind of damaging spell, or they can be very useful. They can trick people, they can deceive, or they can hide you, or maybe make something appear to be there that's not. And those are super useful and super important. But in your guys' opinion, do you think it's more important for people to focus really on like what kind of cantrips they get, or do you think overall it doesn't really matter because their other spells are better?
I know for me it depends on the party composition up at that point. If you have somebody who is mostly focused on playing someone who is more support than anything else, you can start to choose more cantrips and spells that are more damage based. Whereas if your party composition doesn't have somebody who's support or utility, then you can start to focus on those and maybe give yourself one or two damaging things, but that's really all you need. You don't need to flood your spells with damage.
I personally think it's very, very important to have utility and support rather than damaging spells per se. I typically fill in that role of the utility / support spellcaster if I'm playing one, but I think overall I think it's very important your spells and cantrips that you choose, because but some of the time, I'd say probably about half of the time, you can't change them. You pick a spell and you're stuck with that spell, and so I think it's pretty important that you can kind of map out what you want per se over other things. But cantrips per se are very important. I typically run with one damaging cantrip and the rest I do utility, because I think utility cantrips are the best because you never run out of them.
Yeah, very true. But from to play the devil's advocate here, someone with a bunch of different types of damage that they can pull out whenever they want, that can be really amazing
Really
too.
useful.
Like somebody, let's say this creature, everything they're throwing at it's just not working, and you in the back with your unlimited numbers of spells with a variety of different damage start throwing things at it, just different things, just pinking off of it. Just say, well, let's try fire, how about lightning, how about force, how about necrotic, how about radiant, and eventually you'll find something that works.
Reminds me of one wizard in particular.
Yeah, or at least that's the hope, that you'll find something that works. You don't
Yeah.
always get that lucky.
Yeah. Depends on how malevolent your DM is.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
But the
doesn't-
rest of the
doesn't that decide
spells,
everything?
the rest of the spells are sorted by level, and they can go all the way up to level 9 spells, which are the highest you can actually cast in game. And the way that they are sorted and way that you cast them is with something called spell slots. Do either of you want to explain a little bit more, like what spell slots are? Like how do you guys think of them when you think spell slots?
Yeah, so with spell slots, different classes will have different amounts. So generally, say you are a bard, you might have 3 first level spell slots. That means that in one day, before you take another long rest, which is 8 hours, then you can only cast 3 first level spells. And that's the same thing all the way up to level 9. It's however many spell slots you have, that is how many spells of that level you can cast per day. Unless you have a class that might have, I think Wizards is what it is, that you can regain spell slots after a short rest.
Yeah, it's one of their class features, I believe.
Yeah, so essentially spell slots is how many spells that you can cast of that level. And you can cast spells, if you have high level spell slots, a lot of spells let you cast them higher than they should be, and then you gain extra damage or you gain extra effects.
Yeah.
But there's also another system that I like to sometimes use. No one has actually taken me up on it, though, as players. It's called spell points. And if you come from a game where there's a mana system, like maybe a video game RPG, spell points work a lot more like mana, where you have a set amount of points and spell slots get converted into points, and certain spells cost a certain amount of points to use. And that's also available, that's actually in the Dungeon Master's Guide if anyone thinks they would prefer that method to casting spells, because it definitely gives you more freedom to cast different spells at different levels.
I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, rather than using...
Yeah, you can choose to cast, like, really, really powerful spells, just not as much throughout the day, whereas, you know, the rest of your spells are all cantrips, maybe. Or you can just, like, every turn, be cranking out more damage than the average cantrip because you're casting lower level spells, but you have more spell slots, so you're not so worried about, you know, how many you have left.
Yes, like, for example, you can cast, you know, I think Fireball is the one I usually use. It's the one everyone knows. It's a 3rd level spell. If you were level 20 wizard, you could cast it 27 times at its base level before you would run out of spell points. Whereas normally you could only cast it... Yeah, that's the only thing you cast. Whereas if you cast it normally, you'd maybe be able to cast it, you know, 4 times before you run out of that spell slot level.
But then you could do higher levels.
Yes, you could do higher levels, but then you're still not using it as much as you could. So it's an option for people who want to look into it or maybe want to ask their DM about it.
Also, another thing to note with cantrips that we missed real quick. Cantrips that are damage based will also level with you.
Yes.
So once you reach higher intervals of levels, you'll be able to deal more damage with your damaging cantrips.
I believe it is as 5th level, 11th level, and 17th level.
Yeah, I believe that is correct.
Yeah, I believe so as well. Yeah, very good point. I had forgotten about that. Yeah, so if you take a cantrip that is damaging, as you level up, eventually it will level up with you. You will gain that extra damage as well, to the point where you'll do more damage with a cantrip than you might with, say, a 1st level spell eventually.
I think it's better though at balancing, you know, because some martial classes they get more attacks or they deal more damage as they level up, and some spellcasters, they at least, you know, their bare minimum cantrips, they deal a little bit more damage to kind of keep up with the other classes.
Yeah, we're still level the playing field a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So yeah, that is starting from the top. That is how you go through and create your first character. There's a lot of things to look at, a lot of things to think about. If you maybe don't want to touch on spells, you can use a class that, like maybe fighter or rogue or monk, that doesn't use them. Or if you really love the idea of spells, you know, you can jump right in with druid or cleric or wizard. And we definitely want to do an episode on each class later, you know, how they work, how their features work, and how they're played, and how they pair with different races and backgrounds. So we'll definitely be doing that at some point, so be sure to listen in if you're interested. Until then, I'm Ben.
I'm Jake.
And I'm Michael.
And this has been Traveler's Tips and Tales.